Welcome to the Grumpy Social Workers podcast with me, Soyeb
and me, Siobhan McLean. Here's your place for social work conversations that keep things real. So today we're going to be talking about social work and professional identity. And I know that this is a topic you are absolutely passionate about, Soyeb. We always end up talking about this topic whenever we meet. So do you want to start us off by saying why you're so passionate about it?
Absolutely. I think Siobhan is definitely a topic that I'm really passionate about, and probably a subject that makes me the most grumpiest, probably from anything else. And I suppose it kind of started because I started off my social career working as a social worker, working in a local authority setting. And then when I moved from local authority to the NHS, I really had to think about my identity as a social worker, because I was working within a medical model and I was working in an organisation where there weren't many social workers, and I was working in a team where I was the only social worker as well. So it really kind of made me think about what my role within that setting is. So although I was employed as a social worker, my job title was not social work either. So a lot for me to think about that stage. And I think when I first came into that role, one of the things I felt I had to do was completely change the medical model to a social work model. And I think as I became more wise and realized I wasn't making much impact in achieving that, one of the things I learned was that I need to actually influence the medical model, because we're working in a framework which is the medical model. And there's some really good kind of aspects of the medical model, but it was missing this kind of the social work element of it. And I think that's when the frustrations began, because when I was kind of bringing those social work perspectives, trying to influence or bring in social work models and theories, they weren't really being taken seriously or being considered. And I think that's when that frustration came in. So there's been a lot of years of me kind of understanding my identity to be able to navigate some of that. And I suppose for my colleagues, it's been a massive challenge as well, because I think in the medical model, they come across OTs and psychologists and nurses and doctors and AHPs. And sometimes social workers are aligned to AHPs, but we're not AHPs and we're not allied health professionals. We're a separate entity, full stop. So I think it's a struggle for them to really understand that aspect as well. So a lot there to think about. And I suppose one of the first things I did to kind of maintain my identity as a social worker was to have students. So in the NHS, we didn't really have students either. So I did my practice educator training and we started getting student social workers. And I think that really helped, because it brings a different lens to the situation as well. And the students come into placement with us with that lens of what they've learned within their academic work and academic modules as well.
Yeah, I agree, Soyeb. I think working with students can be so good for our professional identity. But I think there's a couple of things there. It also helps students develop their professional identity outside of that local authority. Because one of the things, particularly in England, that makes me really grumpy is that students only see social work as local authority work. And actually it isn't. And I think that's so important. I mean, I think I've always had that, because when I first qualified, I wasn't employed I didn't have social worker in my title. I was employed as a resettlement worker by the NHS. Then I went on to being specifically named as a social worker, but still employed in the NHS. And then it wasn't until my third job that I went into the local authority. But I saw all of that as social work. So I think all the way through that 36-year career that I've had, I've always seen social work as something that we do. It's not necessarily about having a job title, and it's not necessarily about where you're employed. And then when I started to work internationally, it also became clearer to me that social work is much broader than just a local authority. But we do have this view, I think, this pervasive view in England that that's what it's about. And so I've heard students say things like, I didn't get a social work placement. I wasn't with social work. And I just think, of course you had a social work placement. You had to have 2 social work placements to pass your social work degree. And it's just in terms of how they view social work and how they see social work. And I think we've just made our view of social work so narrow that it's really problematic, I think. And that impacts on identity massively. So I think having students helps us revisit our core as social workers wherever we are. But it also, if you're having students in different settings like you in the NHS in England, it really helps students to understand social work more broadly as well. I think that's really important.
No, I'd agree with that, Siobhan. I think in terms of what you've just said, there is this view about, and when I go into universities in England, I speak to students, they get quite shocked that I actually work in an NHS setting, and they don't realize that they can actually do placements in a non-local authority organisation, including an NHS setting. I mean, we're going off tangent a little bit, but I think there's some responsibility on social workers who have been in the profession a long time to go into universities, make those links and influence some of that, I think, ourselves as well. But yeah, there is such a huge interpretation that social work is statutory work only. And then we go on to that kind of definition in terms of what is statutory work as well. Because often people will, and this is another kind of bit that makes me really grumpy and infuriates me actually, when I'm told that I don't do statutory work. It'd be great if I didn't, because I could walk away every day at 5 o'clock and not worry about anything coming back on me because I'm not doing any statutory work, which is not the case at all. So it's how people view statutory work as well. And I think there's such a focus that is either child protection or safeguarding, etc., etc. So I think there's different elements there, isn't there? But yeah, absolutely. In terms of that social identity, but I think the fact that I've not had that role as well, I think makes you really think about your own identity and makes you fight for your identity a little bit as well. So it's really nice to work in settings where you really have to speak up for the profession, but really kind of advocate for those kind of social values and ethics as well, which I think has made me hopefully a stronger social worker in that sense as well. Whereas people who feel that they've had it on a plate in terms of statutory work maybe feel that they've not had to do that in terms of their identity. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, it completely makes sense. I think if you spoke to some social workers who, say, like a local authority social worker who's been a local authority social worker all their career, and you talk to them about what does your social work identity mean to you, I'm not sure that they would be quite as passionate about it or understand it as fully. But when we're in settings like, for example, the NHS, or when we're in different settings, we do have to fight for our identity. I think that's really interesting. And I'm being really careful to say when we're in settings like the NHS in England, because of course, where I live now in the north of Ireland, all social work is an NHS function. So, and sometimes when I say that to people, they don't understand what I'm saying, but it's not a local authority function over here. So people are maybe in England a bit more used to adult social workers working in the NHS, and maybe CAMS workers, but they don't get that actually child protection teams are NHS over here. So, I'm being quite careful when I'm saying NHS in England, but I think it's really important to recognise that social work and what we do can happen anywhere. I mean, I've been fascinated by, and I know you're aware of it, but the energy company that employs a team of social workers. But the energy companies employing social workers, it makes complete sense. And I think all of them should. In France, many social workers are employed as occupational social workers in organisations, and they might be the only social worker in that organisation, but in a factory, there'll be a social worker. I think that's amazing. I think it's really necessary. Veterinary social work, for me, is just fascinating. Social workers who are working alongside of vets, looking at the human-animal bond and seeing that in that wider systemic way of thinking. These are all fascinating areas that social workers are working in, and they are social workers just as much as your local authority social worker. It's the issue of local authority social workers sometimes shutting that down and seeing that as not social work. I think it's really problematic, to hear social workers saying that. And I do think we need to think about, why is that? Why are people, I'm always asking the why question, but why is it that you've got these social workers who are saying, but that's not really social work, is it? Well, yes, it really is social work. And I would question sometimes, is what you're doing as a local authority worker really social work? Or are you just processing and just form filling and just, I think we've got to start that broader conversation about what it is that social work is.
No, absolutely, Siobhan. I think a lot there that you've said, and I think again, I've got to be really careful in what I say now because I will truly get grumpy about this. But I think the frameworks that we work in does allow us to be creative and allow us to kind of work to those true values and ethics of that social work identity as well. I think for students they have to do a statutory placement. So it's how individuals perceive what is a statutory placement. Now I can give very strong evidence to say that we are actually a statutory placement working in an NHS setting, but there's some social workers, like I said, would actually question whether I do any statutory work. So it's kind of looking at that element as well, isn't it? And once you were talking there, Siobhan, I think one of the things that really came to me about was we have social work forums for that very reason, to kind of support the identity, and because everyone's quite isolated. You might have one social worker working on a ward and you might have one social worker in a certain team. So for them to keep the identity is really, really difficult. So we try and have these forums so people can come together and connect on things. And it was actually one of the students that's now qualified social worker, and he decided to set up a forum in the area that he works in just to bring those local social workers together. And I attended the first session, and he started the session by asking everybody why they came into social work. And that was supposed to be just almost like an icebreaker for the hour session, but this kind of took over the entire hour because it was so interesting that it made people really think about why they came into the profession and what they're doing now, and the two didn't seem to align. And when people really had to think about that and reflect on that, it was because of the frameworks that they're working with, or feeling that they actually can't be creative and still bring their own values of why they came into social, but also their social values in the profession as well. So that was a really interesting kind of exercise to do. Because I think when you speak to social workers, there's usually a reason why they come into the profession. I'll often say you don't come into the profession to buy a Ferrari, because you'll be very lucky to be able to afford that on a social worker's wage. But there's another reason why you come into it, and it's kind of remembering those kind of roots as well.
I like the use of the word roots there. I wonder whether we can come back to that in a little bit. But I love the connection there of why you came into it and what you're doing now, and whether those two actually align. And I think that's where, lots of things like moral injury can occur that we've talked about. But it is a really interesting one around the connection between the what and the why question. I do think it's really helpful. But I also think that what we're talking about now links back to our last podcast on supervision as well, because I wonder how much does supervision promote our professional identity, and how much space and conversation is there about social work theory, social work values, social work ethics, all of what it is that makes us a social worker? How much of that conversation are we having? Or is it all about systems and processes, and have you filled in and have you done? Because I think what you're saying there is that it's the systems that are really blocking us and getting in the way, and are they really forming a lot of workers' sense of their own professional identity? The professional identity has to come first, but I think what can happen in some organisations is the systems and the processes are shaping identity instead of the identity being strong. If you've got a strong professional identity, students will sometimes say to me, well, I've not done an assessment. What they mean is I've not filled that form in. They don't know how to fill that form in. But in the 36 years since I've been a social worker, where I've worked, the forms I've had to fill in, what the legislation says, all of that has changed. But why I come into social work and what it means to me has never changed. So I think if we can hold on to that, then all of the other stuff is actually not about our identity. It's about what we work within. But our identity should remain core, I think.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And one of the kind of examples that comes into my Siobhan, and you'll know about this because I've done a session for you on the spiritual model. But, one of the reasons I came into social work was because I really wanted to kind of do something within the local community that I worked with, which was predominantly South Asian Muslim, because I saw gaps there because of my own family experiences of accessing services and stuff. The example we talk about, Siobhan, in that session is around if you have somebody that comes into mental health and their perception of mental health does not align to the mental health medical model, how do we navigate that? and those were kind of the issues I really grappled with in terms of my identity. So when I came into NHS mental health, I'd go and see somebody and they'd tell me that they're hearing voices, but it's because they've been possessed by a spirit or a jinn, or someone's done black magic on them and they want to see a spiritual healer. I sit there thinking, well, the model and the frameworks I work in does allow me to do that. So I'm going to book you in to see a psychiatrist and he'll give you some medication and hopefully that will solve it. Now I'm promoting something which is completely against my kind of ethics and values and my profession as a social worker, because I should be looking at the social perspective on that. And I think, again, really grappling with my identity and really passionate about that. We've worked on that. So over the years, we've been really creative in how we address that. We've kind of really listened and been an advocate, and we probably upset the system a little bit in terms of saying we need to look at this and address it. But we've used evidence-based to do that because we can still, and I think that's a really strong example. I feel really passionate about that where we've created some change, and I think we've still got a lot of work to do around that. But we have really got people thinking about how we can support our patients in accessing the spiritual model, but still work alongside the medical model, and to get the best of both worlds. We're able to access the medical model, but we're really able to kind of look at the person's culture, identity, their religious beliefs, the spiritual beliefs, and still support them with that using legislation, policy, research. And I think those are the examples where we can see how social work can make a difference and influence models that we feel sometimes that we can't.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think there's so much in there and what you've shared. And I suppose in a way it shows how our professional identity links so strongly to anti-oppressive practice, which we're going to talk about in the next podcast. But also I was just thinking about how our personal identity shapes our professional identity then as well. You talking about being, a British Muslim and that being really shaping that element there of what you are wanting to do, working with that community. And I was thinking about how I suppose that framework that we use, our social graces framework that we use to understand who we are, I wonder whether we can really build on that. I know a lot of social workers now use the social graces to think about their own identity and the social graces of the people they're working with. But I'm just wondering whether in that social graces, it doesn't actually have anything about our professional identity. And so I'm wondering whether the next time I'm talking about some of those identity issues with students, I'm going to add in professional identity and try and bring that in somewhere, because I think there's such a connection between our personal and professional identity, I suppose. It just made me think about that and bringing those two together, because we often talk about personal values and professional values and maybe some of the conflicts or some of the similarities there. I'm wondering whether can we talk about our personal identity and professional identity and somehow bring those together?
No, absolutely. I think so. And I have this conversation often in terms of, speaking to students and saying, your own life experiences is something you need to bring into the profession. Don't be scared not to talk about it. I met one of our students last week and she's done really well on placement and she's kind of looking for a job. And she's applied for this job and she's saying, there's going to be lots of social workers who are very experienced applying for that. So because she knew a few of them already. And I said to her, yeah, but you've got lots of experience that they don't. I said, you're female, you're neurodiverse, she's had lots of life experiences, which I know the other social workers haven't. And I say one of the main things also is that you're a student, which means you're fully up to date with current knowledge and skills, which those social workers aren't. They probably can't even, talk about social theory or model because they've been in the medical model for such a long time that they're probably so detached from that. So that's what you need to talk about. And absolutely all those elements of her own kind of identity she can bring to the social profession. And I think sometimes we're scared to do that. And again, I think we forget. You said earlier in terms of roots, and we said we'd kind of come back to that. And we've kind of talked about that in terms of why we come into social work and the roots that bring us there. But if you look at social work and the roots of social work, if you go back in history and look at them, how was social work formed? It was formed on religious and charitable roots. That's where it formed from. And we seem to have kind of lost that element a little bit. And I think going to the other side completely, Siobhan, as well, I think we've not modernized social work either. So we seem to be in a little bit of a limbo where, and again, I have this, it's almost like an ongoing joke, but I am very serious because I say it as a joke, then I say to students, but I am being serious. I say to students, it'd be lovely if one of you decided to go into politics and go to become the next prime minister, because politics has such a massive influence on social work, on those day-to-day things that we're trying to deal with, support people with, and we're dealing with ourselves as well. And imagine if you went into politics with those kind of your own personal values, but the social values and ethics. Imagine the change you could create with policies and procedures, even legislation. And we often say, let's not talk about that because it's politics, or let's not get political, but we need to. And we're going to talk about AI and things as well, aren't we? Again, we spoke about that, but we've just not modernized. We've just not moved on. Mm-hmm. So I think we've got both spectrums where we forgot our roots completely, but we've not moved with the times in some ways either.
Yeah, I do think that's fascinating. I mean, during my career, I've seen that professionalization of social work is what it's often been called. But, when I first qualified, it wasn't regulated. It wasn't a protected title. I think some of those things are really positive. I think, regulation of social work is a really good thing. And I think some of the professionalization is really good. But some of the professionalization, I think, has led us away from that human to human contact and that really understanding ourselves and the core values and principles of just kindness and social justice. But I also think that commitment and understanding of politics is fascinating. I mean, there's just been the elections, haven't there, in England, and local elections, I know. But I was fascinated. I kept wandering in to see what the election results were, and it's actually quite a scary thing at the moment, at the way politics stands. And maybe we'll talk about that when we think about anti-oppressive practice. But I do think that there is a core connection between social work and politics with a small p, but it is very significant, I think. And when I have worked internationally and I've met lots of social workers, say in Scandinavia, they tell me that actually it's very common for social workers to go into politics there. And maybe that's why many of the decisions and policies that come about, I can see a social work value in a lot of the kind of decisions and politics and policies that they have in a lot of those Scandinavian countries. I do think it's interesting. In America, actually, it's one of their core roots for social workers is to go into social policy and advocacy for policy changes and things. So I do think there's more awareness of that link with that political side, and that we're talking about society, and that's really what we're all about. We are social workers, so we work in society, and it's influenced by politics. So I think you're right. There are lots of things about our roots and branches and where we go to and what we do. I do think is really interesting. But I'd said to you I wanted to return to that roots idea, and it's because there's a quote that I use quite a lot, and it's on one of the cards that students can bring to supervision. And a student that I'm supervising, she bought this card recently. It's a postcard and it has a picture of a tree on the front. But on the back, it says, "When the roots are deep, there is no reason to fear the wind." And she bought it because she was talking about learning more about theory during her placement and how that's given her some strong roots. And she feels like she's got these roots now because she's stepped up into a social work role from being a social work assistant. So for her, it's like, I'm really stepping into that identity. So she was talking about learning the theory and the legislation and the roots of social work. But then I was telling her about there's this really interesting project that I found out about. I think it's something to do with NASA and the American Space Agency or something. And they had this project called the Biosphere Project, right? It's like a massive giant Eden project. And basically they're trying to look at how to grow things. So you could maybe, I don't know, go and live on the moon or whatever, but they're trying to grow things in this controlled environment. And they replicated sun and rain and all of that. And everything grew really well, except trees, right? Trees didn't grow. And they grew to a certain height and then they would topple over and they didn't know why. And they worked out eventually that it was because they'd got rid of the wind because they saw wind as being wholly problematic and predatory to the trees. But actually, the lesson they learned was if the trees don't have something blowing against them, their roots don't bed down strongly enough. They only have very weak roots. So as the tree grows, it doesn't hold the tree up. And I think that's a really kind of strong piece of learning about our professional identity. Like you've talked a lot about the challenges that you've faced and how they've made you be clearer about your identity. And I think when we don't have challenges, our roots don't bed down deeply enough. When you're challenged about something, you kind of stand firm. Hang on, this is a social work issue, and you kind of stand firm on it and your roots get deeper. But when you're not challenged, your roots will be very surface and they won't hold you up for very long. So maybe the more challenges you face, the longer you can stay in social work, the stronger you are. But I do think that phrase of when the roots are deep, there is no reason to fear the wind. It's so connected into, I think it's an African proverb, but it's so connected into our identity as social workers. And it's fascinating because it was literally only last week I was talking about that with a student.
So interesting that. Yeah, absolutely. And I think I'd kind of agree with that, Siobhan. And I've said that earlier in terms of having to fight for my identity has probably made me stronger as a social worker because I've had to really kind of fight for the identity. But also in terms of using the acronym of trees, I suppose the other bit linking back to our previous podcast is how we kind of then maintain that identity as well. Because I know I've been able to, because when you face so much challenge, you want to give up or you think, something, just I'm so frustrated with this now, it's not worth the fight. It's easier just to go along with the system in a way. But the support I've had around me in terms of other individuals, that peer support, good supervision has really kind of helped with that. And I think that's the other bit probably that really helps with that social identity as well. So if you're getting supervision from another social worker that's got that strong identity as well, it really helps and support you, which is, I think, why students and NQSW do so well, because they've got a very strong framework of supervision. And within supervision or within that kind of year, you have to look at reflection, critique, think about theory, practice, legislation. So all those things are continue to be embedded. And as soon as you finish your ASY year, that almost just disappears. I don't think people, unless again, if it's not that twice a year registration bit, people don't even reflect. Just going back on two things that you made me think about something, Siobhan, is when you kind of mentioned the word in terms of kindness and caring. And I think that humanistic approach, that humanistic element of social work, we work in such a fast-paced environment now where sometimes I think we forget as social workers that we are working with humans and we are humans as well. And we need to kind of give people time, allow them to tell the stories and stuff. And that's something I really talk about. And again, going back to COVID and things, it completely changed, didn't it? We were doing virtual assessments. I was assessing somebody in a care home that's 95 with dementia on a video call. That person has never spoke to somebody on a phone, a video call. They don't understand the concept of it. And based on that, I'm determining whether they should be placed on adults or not. So those things, I think, have had a huge impact as well. The way we work, the virtual way of working and things as well. And society made me think about that, Siobhan, as well, in terms of our identity. Again, when you tend to hear about social work in the media when something's gone wrong, so either a child's died or somebody with mental health issues has either killed themselves or killed somebody else, suddenly if there's a social worker involved in that, we hear about it because a social worker made a mistake or potentially didn't do what they should have done. But we don't hear about all the fantastic work social workers do day in, day out. And I think it's something about how we portray ourselves on social media as social workers as well. So I think that there's a lot of work to do around that as well.
There really is a really significant challenge with that, isn't there? Because, I've always kind of wondered about how do we represent ourselves better? Because there is that kind of stereotype, isn't there, of, nurses are angels and social workers are child snatchers or woolly do-gooders, or that they're not. People don't have a positive view of us. But then I think, well, if we had a television program about us, like, I don't know, Blue Lights is a great program at the moment about police. Do you have a television program about us? But then the stories aren't our stories to tell, and if they did do some kind of program about us, they would probably overly sensationalize it and be all very negative. And so I do wonder, how do we better promote social work? But sometimes I just think it has to be about what we do, really. I was with a student a little while ago, and she was doing some community work, and one of the people in the session was really brave and said, I have a terrible view of social workers. I think you're awful, and actually said that. And at the end of the development work that this social worker had done, this particular person gave her a card and said, you've really changed my view of social work. And I thought, I think it's important that sometimes it is about what we do on a day-to-day basis. I know so many people who won't tell people that they're social workers. I remember standing at the school gates with my kids and saying I'm a social worker, and people would start trying to explain their kids' bruises and stuff. It can be a really tricky thing for us to talk about. But I think we've got to be prouder and braver and talk about what it is that we do. And the difference that we can be in people's lives, I think, is really important. But they're not our stories to tell. So I think that's also something that's really, how do we promote all that positive stuff that we do? We can't really share.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I suppose in terms of making some closing remarks, I'm thinking about what you've just said is really difficult. And I think some of it is how we portray social work in a positive light within the social work profession itself. And, the whole purpose of the podcast is kind of looking at or talking about social work identity and looking at it in terms of that breadth viewing, not just kind of, we do statutory work if we're working in a local authority, but all the kind of other aspects of social work that we need to be thinking about. We spoke about care, kindness, the humanistic approach as well, and all those kind of values and ethics, that advocacy, social justice, human rights. And sometimes that sounds really cheesy, but that is what social work is, and how we bring that to every setting that we work in. So if we're working in such a setting, and I used to do this, where there were cases where we're thinking about removing a child from a family, I'd be the awkward one asking, well, have we really explored that? Have we really understood the family's perspective on how you look after a baby, the upbringing of a child from a cultural perspective, religious, spiritual, what is the understanding of that? What's the understanding of safeguarding? Have we really done that work? So really kind of bringing that voice of the family and that individual to the scene as well, and really working in terms of supporting each other as social workers. I think that's really key as well in terms of that identity bit. So really kind of supporting our social work colleagues when they do bring up an issue where they're frustrated with something because they don't think that social perspective is being considered, so that they're not just a lone voice, but collectively trying to support. And I think that's the other bit, the collectiveness of social work seems to have disappeared a little bit as well. So how we kind of revive that a little bit. Yeah,
I think you're right. I think that collective, collegiate kind of nature of social work we need to maybe revisit and think about. I do think that's really important. And how we promote social work within social work is another really important one. I think we've already mentioned this on one of the others, but how when new social workers come in, they get told things like, oh, I don't know, I wouldn't do it if I had my time over again. I don't know why you want to be a social worker. And just being, trying to hold up that positivity about social work whilst keeping it real, but also holding up that what it is that we do and what our values are about, I think is really important. So maybe we should pose a question to people who are listening into our grumpy conversations. And maybe we should ask people, what do you see as being key to your professional identity? So how would you describe your professional identity as a social worker? And maybe try and explain that. One of the things that I do, and I think is absolutely fascinating, but I do it in training, is I ask people, if you had to describe social work and your identity in just 3 words, how would you do it? And it's so fascinating to see. Sometimes I can tell how somebody's feeling that day by which 3 words they choose. It's really interesting, the kinds of words that you get. But, my words would always include the word hope, for example, because for me, one of the core aspects of what social work is about is hope. It's always about hope. Everybody has hope and a right to hope. And yet not many social workers refer to hope. So it's interesting to think about, if you just had 3 words, what would be your 3 words? Maybe that's a challenge that we can give to people, and take that into your teams, take that into work and ask everybody, if you had 3 words to describe your social work identity, just 3 words to describe social work, what would those 3 words be? And I'll bet you we've got a massive variety of words. And that's why it's so hard for like the International Federation of Social Workers to define social work, because social workers themselves can't even agree on the words. But, you know, what 3 words is a really interesting maybe challenge for us to pose at the end of the podcast today. What do you think?
Sounds good. I'm trying to think of 3 words and I can't think of them, Siobhan. So it's definitely a challenge. But yeah, absolutely. Really good challenge. And I think that beginning one I spoke about in terms of getting people to think about why they came into social work as well. I think that was a really good reflective piece of exercise that we did that day with the newly qualified social worker. So I think that really gets you thinking as well. And hopefully brings you back to your roots as a social worker as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're posing a good few questions there, aren't we? We hope you've enjoyed sharing this reflective space with us today. We are the Grumpy Social Workers, Siobhan McLean and Soyeb Aswarat. Listen out for more episodes in the future, and don't forget to let us know what you're feeling grumpy about.